Welcome to Recap King. In this video, we will explain Undisputed. This movie tells the story of a heavyweight boxing champion who recently went to prison. A big battle ensues when he challenges the best fighter in prison, who was often crowned undisputed, to prove that he is the only one who is invincible. Can a heavyweight boxing champion defeat the strongest prisoner? Let's find out in Undisputed. Undisputed begins by showing the atmosphere of a fight in prison called Sweetwater. Inside the prison, competitions are often held where prisoners can participate. They are required to fight each other in boxing matches with very loose rules, while their fight will be a massive betting event that benefits a secret syndicate that is hosting it. In this fight, a prisoner named Vern Van Zant will fight the undisputed Monroe Hutchen. Monroe can easily beat Vern in just one round with his abilities as a professional boxer. After the match, the commentator announced that Sweetwater would have a heavyweight boxing champion, George Chambers, nicknamed the Iceman, who was sent to prison for rape. The next day, George came to Sweetwater by helicopter and was in a holding cell with a man named Mingo Pace. When George expressed all his wishes while in prison, two prisoners named Ripstein and Campos came to George's cell. Ripstein, a mafia boss, seems interested in George because he is a famous heavyweight boxer. However, Ripstein told him that there was a very great boxer in prison who was able to beat him. Feeling disapproved of being belittled, George got up and was about to attack Ripstein. But Campos then rushed to calm George down and said his boss didn't mean to cause trouble. Campos then informed that the undefeated champion was Monroe Hutchen, nicknamed the Undisputed. In the prison cafeteria, George tries to find out about Monroe Hutchen and asks other prisoners about him. George finally ran into Monroe and tried to provoke him, but he remained calm. Feeling neglected, George then slapped him to make him angry. Sure enough, Monroe retaliated against George's actions, and a fight almost broke out if the guards hadn't arrived in time to separate the two of them. George was then taken to the warden's office, where he received a stern warning from the warden to behave himself while in Sweetwater. However, George instead asked for special treatment in prison because he is the world boxing champion who has won many championships. He tries to instigate the warden with the idea that he can bring about major changes to the prison and make it famous with massive publicity. Meanwhile, Monroe was punished in another place by being thrown into solitary confinement. The next day, while the inmates were gathering in the field, George asked Mingo about the crime that got him in prison. Mingo then told George that the question was inappropriate because it violated the ethics and could offend other prisoners. But George doesn't care about this and instead asks a similar question to a prisoner named Ratbag. At first, Ratbag ignored the question and chose to ignore George. However, George, annoyed because he felt belittled by Ratbag, tried to provoke him until Ratbag threw his fist at George's face. Ratbag looks happy because he managed to hit the face of the world boxing champion. But then, George returned the blow, which then knocked him down. George then told all the prisoners that there was only the real champion in prison, and the champion was not a loser prisoner like Monroe Hutchen, but a world-class boxing champion, namely himself. However, because of George's arrogant attitude, many inmates hate George and try to warn him to be kind. One of them was a prisoner named Willard. However, George, who does not accept the warning, then beats him. The fight was unknown to the prison guards, so George did not receive any punishment. Elsewhere, Monroe is seen discussing the plan to transfer him to another prison with a female officer named Darlene. Monroe seemed relaxed and didn't really care about the transfer plan because he would still be in prison anyway. He then remembered the past when he was still a professional boxer who was hailed by many for winning many championships. However, Monroe's career as a boxer ran aground halfway when Monroe discovered that his wife had cheated on him and killed the man who was his wife's affair until Monroe was sentenced to life in prison. The scene then switches and shows George getting into a fight with an inmate named Eddie Jones who intends to recruit him. A fierce fight was inevitable when Jones' gang helped him against George. However, George could easily beat them all. After that, George was called to the warden's room. A man named Lipscomb was very disappointed in George because he had made a lot of noise in the last 10 weeks and caused 5 prisoners to be in intensive care in the hospital because of the severe injuries they received after being beaten all out by George. Sensing the brewing hatred for the heavyweight champion, Ripstein senses potential in a match between the modest Monroe the Undisputed Hutchen and the egomaniacal George the Iceman Chambers. Ripstein then asked Campos to prepare everything and immediately coordinate with their criminal syndicate to arrange betting events outside the prison. However, Ripstein apparently experienced obstacles from Warden Lipscomb, who was reluctant to give permission for the fight. Ripstein then tried to persuade the warden to give permission. Because subtle persuasion did not work, Ripstein was forced to threaten Lipscomb so that he was finally forced to comply with Ripstein's request. However, with some conditions, namely, the fight must be held while Lipscomb is on vacation, and he does not want to be involved in anything related to the illegal competition. In addition, Lipscomb emphasized that no one was allowed to record or cover the fight and that everything would go back to normal when he returned from his vacation. Ripstein agreed to all the conditions put forward by the warden, and they both finally reached an agreement. The scene then switches and shows George receiving a visit from a man named Lewis. George then told Lewis that he would be released from prison if he managed to win against Monroe Hutchen. However, Lewis told him that Monroe Hutchen was a heavyweight boxer who had never been beaten in his career. George seemed relaxed about this, because for him, Monroe's career as a professional boxer had been destroyed 10 years ago when Monroe was thrown into prison for murder. George was apparently still arrogant and thought he was much better than Monroe. Lewis then warned George to be careful when fighting Monroe, because according to him, Monroe had not shown his best ability when he was still a professional boxer. Hearing this, George even misunderstood and thought Lewis underestimated him, so he got angry. Elsewhere, Ripstein is making a deal with Monroe regarding the fight, in which he promises a reward of 30% of their profits if Monroe wins the fight. However, Monroe asked for a reward of 40%, because he would give the money to his sister who had to support her 3 kids alone without a husband or steady job. After reaching an agreement with Monroe, Ripstein then goes to George and tells him that Monroe is ready to fight against him. George looks so excited, because in this match, he will show his prowess and prove that he is the one who is more worthy of the title in and out of prison. A few days before the match, Monroe and George were seen training hard to prepare for the fight. One day, George returns to Monroe and tries to provoke him again by asserting that George is the one who will win the match and become the greatest champion who will beat him. But this time, Monroe was not bothered and instead replied to George's words so badly that George became irritated and chose to leave. After that, the inmates, who were very annoyed with George because he was so arrogant, tried to irritate George by ringing their cutlery to cause a commotion. Not only that, several prisoners then got up and tried to gang up on him. However, the prison guards immediately acted by securing George and quelling the chaos before it escalated. On the other hand, Campos gets pressure from his syndicate outside the prison, who wants Ripstein and Campos to set the course of the fight and make George the winner because many people are betting on George's victory. However, Campos flatly refused the request because Ripstein, a lifelong boxing fan, wanted the match to be fair. Not only that, but Monroe will not be willing to give up even though he is lured by a fantastic fee. On the other hand, Monroe and George seem to increase the intensity of their training ahead of the match, which will take place soon. After that, Eddie Jones and several prisoners who had been beaten badly by George appeared to come to Monroe and offer help so that he could win the match easily. They apparently intended to poison George before the match started. However, Monroe subtly declined the offer of Eddie Jones and the others. Monroe thought he wasn't a very nice person, but he wasn't a coward and would face George in a fair match. The night of the match arrived. Everyone seemed enthusiastic because they waited so long for the biggest fight between the world boxing champion, George the Iceman Chambers, and the undefeated champion at Sweetwater, Monroe the Undisputed Hutchen. The match was witnessed by the prisoners and several mafia bosses who had made the match a betting event that would bring huge profits. Monroe and George warmed up before entering the arena, which had been prepared in such a way. In the first round, Monroe was cornered by George's repeated attacks. Even George managed to bring him down at the end of the first half. George felt he had the upper hand, ignoring the audience hurling hate speech at him. On the other hand, Monroe managed to bounce back and was given 60 seconds to prepare before entering the second round. In the second round, Monroe began to counterattack and was able to outperform George for a while. However, George quickly turned things around and did a barrage of attacks on him until George managed to knock him down at the end of the second round. George became more confident because he managed to bring Monroe down for the second time. He then sparked the audience's anger by using harsh words to respond to hate speech from the audience towards him. Meanwhile, on the other hand, Monroe seemed to be struggling to get back up after being hit by George's barrage in 2 rounds. However, Monroe was determined to win the match to help his sister, who had financial problems, so he rushed to get back on his feet. When the third round began, Monroe immediately launched a series of attacks and managed to find an opening that he could use to block George's attack and give a fatal blow. Sure enough, Monroe managed to push George back through the gap and hit him hard before George realized his weakness in the gap. Feeling cornered by Monroe's attack, which was difficult to parry, and because the audience was always making fun of him, George became furious and launched his attack full of anger. However, filled with anger, George's attacks went awry, and Monroe could easily predict his moves. Monroe then tried to set the rhythm of the match by defending and sparking George's anger to a peak. Unexpectedly, the tactic worked, and George continued to attack Monroe even though the third round had ended, so his manager had to intervene directly before George was disqualified. In the final round, Monroe was finally able to outperform George in every attack, throwing a heavy punch at him and landing a heavy blow in George's face, which immediately knocked him down and won the fight and defended his title as the undisputed champion. The scene then switches, and shows Campos revealing that Ripstein breathed his last exactly 3 hours after the match. But before Ripstein died, he had willed a sum of $2 million to be given to Monroe if he managed to win the fight according to their agreement. On the other hand, George Chambers was released, and Monroe finally accepted the money to give to his sister, who was in financial trouble. Not only that, George Chambers and his manager denied that the fight with Monroe Hutchen ever happened and insisted that it was all just rumors. A few months later, George the Iceman Chambers again won the World Heavyweight Championship. All the inmates at Sweetwater watched the game on television. However, they later laughed and cheered on behalf of Monroe Hutchen after hearing that George Chambers was crowned the undisputed World Heavyweight Champion, because according to them, the real undisputed champion was Monroe Hutchen. The moral that can be learned from this movie is to remain humble even though we have abilities or privileges that other people don't. Do not be arrogant and feel that we are better than others, because this will plunge us into misery in the future.